Okay, if I can call a meeting to order and welcome everyone to this, the 16th meeting of the Public Petitions Committee in 2019. And our only agenda item for this meeting is the consideration of new petitions. The first new petition for consideration today is Petition 1737, lodged by Puneet Dwivedi on behalf of Hindu Forum Britain on the review of hate crime legislation and security funding in Scotland. The petition calls for the Scottish Government to address increasing levels of hate crime in Scotland by providing security funding similar to that in place in England and Wales. We'll take evidence this morning from the petitioner, and I welcome you to the meeting today and invite you to provide a brief opening statement of up to no more than 5 minutes, and after that we'll have some questions from the committee.
Thank you, honourable members of the committee, for inviting me to give witness. My name is Puneet Dwivedi. As you've already mentioned, I belong to an organisation called Hindu Forum of Britain, which is an umbrella body for more than 300 organisations across Scotland. So the main theme of my petition is that all communities being able to worship at their place of worship free from intimidation, violence, or any abusive behaviour. Act of hatred against anyone based on religion, faith, ethnicity must not be tolerated, and government must protect those who are vulnerable. I just want to make 2-3 quick points. The first thing is there is already a place of worship scheme which was announced in 2016 in England and Wales. Last year also there was a fund of 1.6 million to improve security to counter the threats from hate crime at the place of worship. So I'm just requesting the Scottish Government as well to implement this same scheme in Scotland as well. And the second point I wanted to make is the government should treat all forms of hate crime equally. I have seen politicians making selective in choosing a special treatment for any particular religion, like Islamophobia, Hinduphobia, whatever it is. But so those myopic view will continue to disregard prejudice and hate crime faced by other faith. So I request the committee to consider the place of worship security scheme, which is important to provide the congregation with peace of mind when they attend their place of worship. So on behalf of Hindu community in Scotland and all other minority religion, urge the Scottish Government to build a strong legislation framework to protect community from hostility, violence, and bigotry. Always constantly review this legislation from the emerging threats. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we'll move to questions that will help us in the consideration of how we can take the petition forward. Perhaps I can start. I think it would be interesting in knowing the extent of the issues you raise in your petition, and obviously we're aware of some of these from reports, but can you provide some examples of the hate crime incidents you refer to in your petition and the impact this has had on the people who have experienced them?
Yes, I'll give you 2 evidences. Last year there was the door of the Sikh temple Gurdwara in Edinburgh was burned, and then there was several incidents of the Edinburgh Hindu temple, which I'm also a board member, was broken in, and there was robbery and theft in the temple. And you must have heard of the recent attack in Glasgow Gurdwara as well. So, and there has been many incidents where we have this Sunday where the congregation meet in Edinburgh temple. Their car has been vandalized because they are parked properly, but still their car has been vandalized. So the organization I belong to did a hate crime from the police Scotland, the various places of worship. We did in Glasgow temple, we did it in Edinburgh Hindu temple, and a lot of people during that time had said that they had faced hate crime which go unreported. So these are the few evidences which we have collected and presented.
You talked about hate crime incidents going unreported. Why do you think that is, and to what extent do you think these incidents go unreported? So why would people not report, and how big a problem is there in terms of how can you quantify the numbers you think that may be unreported?
I don't have the numbers at the moment, but when there was an open discussion, when they felt comfortable, they came up and said that there were incidents with them for hate crime. I think people are just if it's just a one-off incident, they just ignore it probably, and the other reason they think is they will be judged, and so because of this. Because we do not have such openness, so nobody talks about these things very openly. That is why, because being judged, people just ignore it. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Gail?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Puneet. Thank you for coming in. In your petition, you call for a review of the hate crime legislation in Scotland. What form would you like to see that review take? Is there anything that you would like to see happen that isn't currently happening in the law at the moment?
As I mentioned in my opening remark, there are a few things. First, if you can include the place of worship scheme funding, one of those changes, and the other changes, I've been listening and I follow the news trend. I've seen that all the political parties have accepted the new definition of Islamophobia or anything. So I think all religions should be considered equally. There should not be any special treatment for any religion. Because I belong to a religion which never comes out and speak about things because they're just busy. Because for me, like I work full time, so I have taken a half day to just come for this to present to this. So that's my thing is don't treat anyone special. Every religion, everything can be vulnerable to any kind of a hate crime. So if you have a specific for any specific religion or anything, it might the other things will never get highlighted. So that's the one thing. So it will be disregarded.
Thank you. And just to follow up on the question that the convener asked about specific examples of hate crimes that you've experienced or you know about, the £1.6 million that's been allocated in England, how do you see that? How would that have prevented these crimes had that been allocated in Scotland?
There's either you have to police it every day. So I had written in 2 years back to First Minister and Minister for Community Security, Alan Campbell, and they have suggested that I should report this to police. And I'm very thankful to Police Scotland. We work very closely with them. They come and whenever there is a big gathering, they come and review and present there when required. But you cannot police every time. So with this fund, you can upgrade the security systems, cameras, grills, and things like that. So if you look at this has helped all the churches, gurdwaras, mosques in down south in England to upgrade the security system, so that people will, if somebody want to do an hate crime, they will be hesitant to do that because of the presence of cameras and all those things. So that in that way, it will help the places of worship to be more secure. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
David Torrance?
Thank you, Convener. In your petition, you say you contacted the Cabinet Secretary for Communities and Local Government. What was the response to the issues that you raised?
I have. This was on the back of the incident which happened in 2016 in the Edinburgh Gurdwara and our temple. So the priest in the temple was really scared because he stays in the temple during weekdays there's not much congregation coming into the temple, so he was really scared. So he wanted to go back because he came from Nepal on visa as a priest, so he wanted to go back. So it's very difficult to find a priest here for Hindu faith. So so that led me to research about it. What can we do to improve security? We already have got a camera in Edinburgh Hindu Temple. I think it's there in Glasgow Temple as well. But when I saw that, what can I do? So I thought to write it to the police, then to the ministers, and I got a response that there is no. I just inquired because I saw that there is a place of worship fund available in the gov.uk's website. I saw it's available in Scotland as well. Because we had an incident of hate crime, can we use that fund? Then I inquired about it if this fund is available in Scotland, and I've been told currently this fund is only for England and Wales, not for Scotland. Yeah.
John?
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Davidi, and thank you for your evidence. The Place of Worship Protective Security Fund scheme was launched in England and Wales in 2016. Are you aware of the impact that funding has had on combating hate crime in that time?
So if I have an evidence of
Is there any, what impact is the introduction of that funding south of the border? What has that had?
I think there must be something I'm not aware of, but I believe they must have researched something before launching the scheme. They must have thought there must be some positive things about it. I don't have a data with me what impact it had, but what I believe is that a lot of I don't know if the hate crime has gone down after implementing those legislation, but I'm definitely sure that people feel secure that if there's something, if they have been a target of such hate crime, it just goes reported because there is an video evidence or things like that. So
even a positive impact among the people who come to worship and a feeling of safety.
Definitely, I would say that they would feel secure if their environment where they come for worship is secure, so they will feel secure themselves. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Maurice Corey.
Thank you, Ina. Good morning, sir. Basically, following on from Brian's question to you just now, is having looked obviously in detail, you obviously have done of England, the effects of the law in England and Wales. Are there any changes you would see that should be reflected in Scotland in relation to the results that have happened in England and Wales, and the positives or negatives from that point of view? Would you see any specific here that's happening that's not happening in England and therefore needs to be changed?
No, I'll just repeat the same thing. It should be just for all religion. It's just not to be specific to particular. All minority or even majority religion should be open for everybody. Should not be specific to anybody who has been a target in the past or are vulnerable for the target of hate crime. Should be given to everybody. So that's.
Can I just
Yeah.
I understand that. I mean, but basically what I'm saying is that you've obviously studied what's been happening in the law in England and Wales, okay, and seen the cause and effect, okay, of the whole issue. Are there any things that are unique to Scotland that you would feel you want to actually implement or add on to the law should this be brought in?
Can I come back to this later on with the detail or something in an email or
Of course. Brian Whittle.
I think earlier this year the Scottish Government consulted on the amendments of hate crime legislation. Do you think that sort of proposed amendments would have a positive impact and improve Scotland's hate crime legislation, and then obviously in turn then protect people who are victims of hate crime?
Yes, I think that will help. And the other thing I wanted to say about, I filled a lot of surveys which government put on their website, but the way the questions are presented is very convoluted, and it's very not easy for it's not in a simple word, so it's very difficult for somebody to interpret and write something. So one of my suggestions is to keep it very simple, the questionnaires or surveys, so that anyone can understand and write about it. I looked at the hate crime survey. Some of the questions are so convoluted that you don't know how to respond to that. So yeah, that's one of my suggestions.
Just a quick follow-on to that. So what you're saying is that perhaps is related to the fact that a lot of hate crime is going unreported, and it's not particularly easy to report.
No, what I'm saying is that when you put this surveys or the consultation on websites, the questions you ask to fill the surveys, sometimes it's very confusing for people to respond on those surveys. So my suggestion is just to keep it very simple, so that just to respond to those questions.
Okay.
And perhaps they should be more proactive, going out and meeting with various groups to talk to them about potential legislation, rather than simply putting out a survey.
Yeah.
Can I ask just a couple of points before we move on? Going back to this issue about people not reporting, do you think we need to do more to encourage people to speak up about hate crime incidents? And how do we do that in a way that people feel safe?
I think one of the things I think is detailed study of the religion, which I think many people, when I came to Scotland like 12 years ago from England, and once I was driving and somebody shouted at me, Paki or something like that, which is I just ignored it, and there's another incident where my wife has been treated like as if I mean the thing is that majority people do not understand the difference between different religions, so there should be detailed studies. I think the schools are teaching about, my daughter goes to school and I know schools are teaching about the different religions, which is really a good thing. So I think there should be more detailed study about the different aspects of different religions so that people are educated and know the differences. Yeah.
And if funding was provided, how do you think it should be shared out? I hear what you're saying about there shouldn't be a hierarchy, all faiths should be treated equally. In fact, I think there's been some, certainly I've seen some correspondence where the Jewish community have been more concerned or have been very concerned about security around schools. So I just wonder, so this is obviously something that across faiths people have a concern with. Do you think it should operate that a group would bid in for the money because they think there's an issue, or do you see a different way of doing it?
What I think is that if there has been any incident in the past and it was investigated by police and they think that there was really a hate crime, or that there was enough evidence that those group or those area where the place of worship is vulnerable for hate crime, so those should be considered for under this scheme. That's my suggestion. Is
okay. Any other questions? No. You mentioned that you would come back to us with some information. Obviously, after this, and you've had time to reflect, if there's anything further you want to add, then please feel free to contact the clerks. That would be really useful. I think. Obviously, I think there are quite important issues here. It is something that people have spoken about around hate crime, the vulnerability of churches, synagogues, temples and so on, and perhaps the vulnerability of young people who are going to these places perhaps at other times when it's not just for worship but maybe for education. And I think that you make an important point, I think, about people feeling insecure and not reporting, and this is something that has been addressed elsewhere. But I wonder whether I suppose we want to get a sense of how that scheme works. I think it would be worthwhile we've got some information in here about that, but maybe a little more. I don't know what else people think we should be looking at, Brian?
I would be really interested again trying to gather some information around the impact that the scheme has had south of the border. That would be a good starting point. I'm really interested also, I think there's quite this idea of extra security gives people the perception and gives I think that can't be underestimated. Can I just say I think it's really sad in this day and age we still have to deal with this. But I would be I think we should maybe be writing to all the stakeholders, all the variety of religious leaders within Scotland would be a good place to start, perhaps Police Scotland as well.
Yeah, and I think there's also a number of interfaith groups that we could contact, but I think we should be looking to just get a sense of what different people's experiences, and also recognising, I think, the point that there are hate crimes which are expressed in various ways, and you've already described some, and some of them are expressed through violence against actual places of worship, but sadly it happens in people's everyday life. And I think we could also be writing to the Scottish Government to get how they see, since they've decided not to go down this route, is it something they've looked at? Is there some reason why they've not done that? And are there other options that they might be considering? Morris?
Gentlemen, I know that in some faiths there are security teams within the faith themselves. I've been to one or two sessions in Glasgow where they've actually had their own internal security available because they're so concerned. Is this quite prevalent generally through other faiths as well in Scotland? They actually have their own. I'm not saying vigilantes, and I'm not using that word, but I'm just saying, you go to an event and you quite clearly see there's 6 or 7 people from the organisation who's there, just watching brief.
I can't speak about other religions, but I've not seen such thing in Hindu faiths where so.
Yeah, but you talk quite knowledgeably about saying that generally other faiths, so you haven't really, you can't say anything about the other ones at all. But
no, I go to all the places because I'm part of interfaith group.
yeah, exactly.
Edinburgh Interfaith as well. Yes, I've seen what you're saying, in whether the members of the committee or the place they are there. Yes, I've seen that. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. So write to Scottish Government, might be worthwhile to write to UK Government as well in terms of the of the scheme itself. I think there's quite a number of things that we can take forward from there, and you've certainly given us. Yeah.
One last question: why was, when this fund was released by UK government, Scotland was excluded? Do you know the reason why it was just for England and Wales, not for Scotland?
I would suspect it'd be under the devolution plans, or in which power is divided. That if we wanted it in Scotland, it would be through the Scottish Government that would do that. And that's really the question we're asking them, that have they looked at it and decided not to do it, or is it something they've not yet considered? And I think that would be useful as well. So can I thank you very much for coming along. We will get a response to these and we'll come back for the committee's further consideration, but at any point if you want to add to the information I've already provided us, that'd be very welcome. Okay, thank you very much. And we can
Thank you.
suspend briefly.
Thank
Call the meeting back to order. And the next new petition is Petition 1729, Legal Protection of Crofts from Local Authority Care Charges, lodged by John McKeever, which calls on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to ensure crofting tenancies are exempt from local authority financial assessments for care charges. The petition has collected 552 signatures online and 415 offline signatures in support. In his petition, John McKeever states that there are inconsistencies in the way that the National Assistance Assessment of Resources Regulations 1992, which allow local authorities to charge for the care they provide or arrange in residential care homes, are applied. These inconsistencies are caused by what the petitioner refers to as a grey area in the law with regard to whether or not a croft and croft property should be deemed to be capital assets. The Scottish Government updated its charging for residential accommodation guidance in July 2019 and has no current plans to change it again, specifically to add crofting. Its position is that, quote, it's for local authorities to interpret the regulations in applying their policies. And I wonder if members have any comments or suggestions for action. Gail?
Yes, I find this actually quite troubling because we know when I was on a rural committee, we committed to a complete overhaul to the crofting legislation, but the very fact that it's being inconsistently applied over local authority areas, I think, is a real worry. I think that the petitioner has a really valid point and that we definitely should be taking it forward. I would definitely write to the Crofting Commission and also write to the local authorities as well, just to find out what their stance is, and then once we get that back we can then think about how we take it further.
I mean, I was a bit concerned that the Scottish Government basically was saying this is not a matter for us in terms of is an interpretation about the legislation. I mean, I was quite taken by surprise that it would be possible, given, and crofting legislation is not my area of absolute expertise, but I'm aware in the past of being told that a croft house is deemed to be an improvement on a croft. It's not seen as something separate unless you've decrofted it, in which case it becomes a different matter. And given losing your croft house and your croft seems a much, you know, nobody wants them to lose their house because of care charges, but that seems to me to be not sitting very comfortably with crafting legislation and its purpose. Yeah. So I think there is an issue here, and it's obviously very alive, and others may have had correspondence from individuals around this, and you can see from the strength of feeling and the support for the petition that it's something that's striking a chord with people. So I mean, I think Gail would be agreeing that we should write to the Crofting Commission and to local authorities, and really asking on what grounds, where are they taking the authority from, making that decision, because I think what comes through in the paper to us is very, there's nothing very strong and clear about the basis on which they're making their decisions. Brian?
Like a lot of these kind of issues, I'm really interested around what the intention of the legislation is, and then, as Gail Ross has said, the interpretation of that legislation by local authorities and how that differs. And I think there is that tension around, giving devolved power out to local authorities, but there must be an intent within the legislation that should be that can be enforced. I would have thought.
Interplay between crafting legislation and the round care charging, because it is quite. It might not be unacceptable that somebody loses their home, but it's quite clear. But it's the status of a croft house in a croft. Is different from a house that would have in the past been part of a croft, and that, I think that's it does feel like as if it's something it's a different step from one that I'd heard before.
I also worry, Convener. I mean, it does say that there was a case on Skye that wasn't followed through, but I do worry that if this one does go through, that it sets a precedent then that it's going to happen to loads of other people, and that's really worrying.
Because presumably if it goes through in one area, then other local authorities which are strapped for cash may continue the same thing. Okay, so we're agreeing to write to the Scottish Government seeking its views in the action called in the petition, and I think asking them not to tell us it's a matter for local authorities, but how they see the interplay between the different legislation in this field. And we've already mentioned the Crofting Commission and local authorities. I mean, obviously people who are maybe interested in the petition may make submissions as well, but that would be something for them. And I think that underlining to those that we're writing to, that we want to understand, actually how these different bits of legislation play in together, and in the context of supporting crofting and the sustainability of crofting in some of our fragile communities. That would be part of it as well. Anything else? No. In that case, can we thank the petitioner very much for bringing that to our attention. As we get responses from the Scottish Government and others, the petitioner, of course, and others will be able to respond to those submissions before we consider it again. If we could then move on to our next petition, which is petition 1730, registration of home-educated children in Scotland, lodged by Kenneth Drysdale. This petition calls on the Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to conduct an urgent review to identify children who are not registered with an education authority in Scotland and are being denied a basic human right to access an education suitable to age, ability and aptitude. The briefing prepared by Spice and the Clarks outlines the current Scottish Government guidance on home education, published in 2008, including the responsibilities of local authorities regarding the education of children. The Clarks have received an email from Alison Pruce, coordinator of the Scottish Home Education Forum, who wishes to make the committee aware that, quote, the duty to provide education during the compulsory years lies entirely with parents, not with individual local authorities, which are simply obliged to provide school education to those who delegate that duty. The briefing also highlights work undertaken on home-educated children by the Education and Skills Committee in 2017 and 2019, looking specifically at children with additional support needs who are being home-educated when their parents felt that the mainstream school was not or could not support them. As a result, the Deputy First Minister wrote to the Education and Skills Committee to say that the current home education guidance would benefit from significant updating to reflect changes to the education landscape in recent years. In his letter, he also stated that Scottish Government officials will be reviewing the guidance during 2019 with a plan to engage with home education stakeholders. I wonder if members have any comments or suggestions for action.
I think that the government's currently looking at it. I think we would have to really wait the outcome of that. because you don't just sort of have set another hair running and duplicate the work. So obviously the government's got it to look at.
I wonder if we can write Scottish Government, however...
Yeah, and see the progress on it.
So, yes, and highlighting this particular aspect of it. 'Cause what struck me about this is there's an element of this about how do we ensure that children at home educated get a good quality of education. We know that some children end up being home educated because the mainstream system will not support them in the way that they need to be supported. And then for others, it's an active choice. But the petitioner makes a slightly different point, which is if a child is educated in school, both parents have a right to be kept informed about the child's progress. They might be able to go to parents' nights and so on. But if one parent is home educating, the other parent, if they're estranged, will not have any influence. Now, that's a separate argument. It's about the rights of the parent who's not looking, with whom the child is not residing, and that's, you know, clearly a difficult area. But it may be something that we could also flag up to the Scottish Government, this particular issue around access of parents who are not the parent with whom the child is residing, if the child is in home education, which I suspect is what's really driving this petition.
One thing concerns me here is it's bringing out the business of learning support and learning difficulties or disabilities. You know, and I think that's something that's really quite concerning to me, that in home education, I'm not saying they don't, you know, parents aren't obviously understand the child, and absolutely, I'm children myself, and therefore there's a certain level of what that child might need, and the perception and the professional input. So there needs to be some way of finding that out if they're going to be home educated.
I think there's an issue about ensuring the quality of education when your child's home educated.
Yeah.
The point I was making was a slightly different one, which was that children who are not having their needs met in school, who are on part-time timetables, who expect to only come in an hour a day or whatever, parents in those circumstances choose to home educate because of the failures of the system, not because of their inadequacies, which is, you know, they feel that the school is not meeting their child's needs, and they then end up coming to that conclusion rather than that being the starting point. But of course we know from the Scottish home education people that this is an active choice for other folk, and they have to be supported in doing that with the protections that you would expect. So we're going to write to the Scottish Government. In terms of stakeholders, it may be that we would want the Home Education Charity for Scotland Schoolhouse to respond to this, because I think they will have a view on that confidence in the system and the access of the non-resident parent. Brian?
Point of clarification here. Is the suggestion here that when somebody's, that there's no checks and balances required for somebody who's home educated? You know, if the parent decides, I mean, I was looking in here about where, you know, they don't need to register if they've never been in state education. They don't have to register that child with the education authority. They can just homeschool them, and it would worry me if there's no checks and balances within the quality of the education that child's receiving.
I'm sure there are, but that was something that we could probably establish.
Yeah.
And again, as I say, the Home Education Charity and others would be able to give us information on that. So I think we're recognising there's a general issue here, but in terms of the petitioner, this issue about the access of the non-residential parents to information about the child's education is an interesting area that we'd ask them to comment on.
Yeah,
okay?
absolutely.
So if that's agreed, we can...
There's in point 18 here, Liz Smith made a comment about the question that the child may be home educated, but the question is still to get the exams and things like that. It's got to be registered. They've got to be registered with an SQA qualified centre. College. I mean, that's something that needs to be addressed too, because it's all very well having them home educated, but if the child is not at the age of whatever it is doing the various exams, they've not registered it, and it might be because sadly, unfortunately, marriage has been a difference of opinion and things like that, which you highlighted already. I think Liz Smith actually makes a very pertinent point on page 4 there. Yeah, so that's something I would really be liking to. On point 18.
Yeah, I think we just, for our own information, I think we want some confidence that young people are not denied access to the exam provision. Other young people would, simply because of the parental choice to educate at home. But again, we want to thank the petitioner. They will have an opportunity to respond to the admissions that are received in this before we consider it again. If we can then move on to the next petition, which is petition 1731 on permitting audio recording of local government public meetings, lodged by Tom Taylor. The petition calls on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to amend the Local Government Scotland Act 1973 to permit audio recording of all public council meetings by members of the public. Our paper for this petition states that most council meetings are open to the public. However, it is at the discretion of local authorities whether to allow or provide sound and video recordings of their meetings. Currently, there are 10 local authorities that broadcast all public meetings, 8 broadcast full council meetings only, and 13 provide no broadcasts at all. A number of councils have debated the cost implications of broadcasting their meetings as a potential barrier, and I wonder if members have any comments or suggestions for action. David?
It'd be interesting to get COSLA's views on this, because you say the cost there is prohibitive, and you know local government finances are tight just now, so it'd be interesting to get their views on it.
I suppose if we can even ask them what they consider to be good practice in terms of transparency, even within limited resources, what would they regard as a basic minimum? Gail?
Yeah, I do note that the petitioner says that he would like members of the public to have the ability to audio record public council meetings. Now, I don't see an immediate issue with that, because I do feel that as elected officials, the public do have a right to know what is being discussed in meetings that are public and public only, because you know, elected officials, elected members do have private meetings as well, because there are sensitive things discussed often to do with staff, etc., which don't need to be out in the public domain. But I would be interested to know, for maybe, as David said, right to COSLA, but maybe individual councils to say why this is not permitted, because even councils that webcast still don't allow members of the public to record stuff themselves, and that might be because they're afraid of interruptions, or you know, phones going off accidentally, or I don't think it's a confidentiality issue, but I would certainly like to know why it isn't allowed at the moment.
Okay, Ryan?
Just as a matter of interest, we don't allow the public to record these meetings either. They are recorded. So I think what's interesting is Gil Ross says the petitioner's not asking the council to record. They're asking for them to have the ability to record. So, but we don't allow the public to record. They can tweet and you know whatever they like on social media, but they don't record in here. So I think I have no problem with the actual premise of it, apart from there has to be some exemptions to that where you know, as I say, sensitive issues should not be in the public domain.
We need to establish whether it is there an issue about local authorities being able to provide to people who are unable to attend the meeting a record of what was said in audio form, and if they don't permit individuals to come along, because I find the strength of the argument round I wasn't able to make the meeting but I could then go and hear what was said, I find that quite strong. But if you're at the meeting and you're recording it, I'm not quite sure why that's so necessary. But although if there is not going to be an official record of the meeting, you can maybe see why people might record it in order to prompt their own memory. So I guess there's some questions here that we might want to ask in terms of, you know, what are the constraints and the limitations on what's been suggested in the proposal. But I think my sense is across the committee we're comfortable with the idea that local authorities, as ourselves, are transparent in our discussions, while we recognise, I think as Gail has said, there will be occasions whereas clearly in the Scottish Parliament we go into private session, that would be appropriate in terms of local authority business as well, particularly when they've got maybe dealing with individual sensitive cases.
Can I just say, I mean, if you look at the introduction, it says this new petition has collected only 2 signatures and 1 comment and support. I mean, I think that says itself. I mean, I know as a councillor, for the years I was in it, if we had very adequate, we discussed this ad infinitum, this subject, I don't know, Gail may as well, and others, is there was a proper record kept, and we were very conscious of those days of, you know, confidentiality and things like that.
Well, you know that we don't put weight particularly on the number of signatures, because obviously some petitions will come from such a direct experience that actually illuminates an issue that people aren't aware of. So I think that's also true. Let's agree to write to Scottish Government and COSLA with their views on this, and we can maybe look at that point whether we want to highlight to individual local authorities if they wanted to respond to it, what their approach is. But this is, to me, the question is not so much how do local authorities make themselves transparent and make recording available, but what is the issue around resisting the idea that individuals could attend council meetings and record them themselves. What would the concerns be there? But obviously, again, we want to thank the petitioner, and there will be an opportunity for the petitioner to respond to the submissions that are made once they come in and before we consider the petition again. Okay, that we can move on to the next petition, which is petition 1732 on a toolkit for working with the pathological demand avoidance profile of ESD, lodged by Patricia Hewitt and Barbara Irvin. The petition calls on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to 1. Draw up in cooperation with others a toolkit for professionals to assist in diagnosing and designing therapeutic support for children, young people and adults who have pathological demand avoidance, a profile within the autism spectrum. 2. Offer training in the use of such a toolkit, and additionally to signpost, promote and facilitate other training by those who have successfully developed therapeutic programmes. And 3. Provide access to appropriate education, therapies and interventions to reduce or minimise the effects of the condition for the individuals and their families and carers. In its latest classification of diseases, the World Health Organization classifies autism spectrum disorders as one of 11 neurodevelopment disorders, but does not list any subcategories such as PDA. In March 2018, the Scottish Government published a refreshed strategy for autism, which included several commitments, for example, to increase investment on the work done by NHS Education for Scotland on the autism training framework, further development of the autism toolbox aimed at the education workforce, and to explore the introduction of a Scottish Autism Research Consortium, which would consider how autism research is translated into practice. And I wonder if members have any comments or suggestions for action. Brian?
We've looked at this before. In fact, the last time this came before us, it was that some local authorities don't even recognise it as a condition, and that the way in which it was treated depending on which local authority you happen to be in. And I think if I'm right in saying with people moving house so they could actually get into another local authority, so it would actually at least be recognised. So it's interesting this has come back here. To me, it means that has moved on, and that there's this recognition that the condition is accepted. We'd be interested to see what the Scottish Government had to say in that particular issue, and also probably the Autistic Society for Scotland. I would still be interested to see whether the recognition of the condition has been accepted.
In terms of when we dealt with the petition last, we closed it on the basis that there was ongoing work in relation to the Scottish Strategy for Autism, but as we've heard, the strategy doesn't identify sort of subgroups within, doesn't name them, and again, I guess this is the issue for those with family members with PDA, that sense that it's still not really acknowledged as a condition in its own right, and therefore there isn't the training that goes alongside that. In fact, I think this whole thing about it's pathological demand avoidance, not defiance. I think there was something in the paper about the idea this is all about defiance rather than it being a condition that a young person can't help. So I think it would be interesting to see whether the Scottish Government does feel that the refreshed strategy addresses this, and are there things that they're willing to do in terms of highlighting the particular condition itself, and as you said, to the various groups who've got an interest in autism, including the National Autistic Society. And I think that would probably be a good starting point, because I think the emphasis now in the petition is around how we let people know how the condition is experienced and how it informs good practice. So if if that's agreed, again, we will wait for a response, and the petition will be able to respond to the submissions before we consider the petition again. If we can now move on to the next petition for consideration, which is petition 1733 on human right to adequate food, lodged by Peter Ritchie on behalf of the Scottish Food Coalition. The petition calls for the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to make the right to food part of Scots law. And for this item, can I welcome Sarah Boyack MSP and Elaine Smith MSP, who have an interest in the issues in this petition. The right to adequate food is an aspect of Article 25 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as well as Article 11 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and Article 24 of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, all of which the UK has signed up to. The Scottish Government's programme for Scotland 2019-20 includes a number of statements in relation to human rights, including the National Task Force for Human Rights Leadership, which will continue its work to establish a legislative framework for a Scottish Bill of Rights. This will be preceded by the end of this Parliament by legislation to incorporate the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. In December 2018, the Scottish Government consulted on proposals for legislation around the Good Food Nation policy. The consultation documents stated that, quote, the option of exploring a right to food which is directly enforceable as a matter of Scots law has not been ruled out. It is best considered, however, as part of the wider work on incorporation currently being done by the First Minister's Advisory Group on Human Rights Leadership. We've also had correspondence from Rhoda Grant MSP, who has expressed an interest in the issues around this petition, and I know these will be highlighted by our colleagues. I wonder if it would be useful for the consideration of the committee if we maybe ask Sarah and Elaine to make their contribution, then we can have a conversation following that. Do you want to start off with you, Elaine?
Thank you very much, Convener. Yeah, I want to speak today in support of the Scottish Food Coalition petitioners who are campaigning for a right to food. And I'm aware that other Scottish Labour colleagues are doing the same, such as Sarah, and the committee has received a letter from Rhoda Grant, excuse me, who supports the petition, but she couldn't be here due to prior engagements. I've incorporated some of her points into my own remarks, if I may. So there is a right to food in international law, as the convener has outlined, but as we know, the current system has not prevented people from going hungry in Scotland. Enshrining the right to food into law in Scotland would enable government to be held to account and be required to ensure that everyone has the ability to access good food, and we could also be considering statutory targets for reducing food insecurity. But can I emphasise the point that enshrining the right to food into law is not literally about handing out food? So if I might just quote what the UN's FAO states, which is, the right to food is not a right to be fed, it is about being guaranteed the right to feed oneself, which requires not only that food is available, that the ratio of production to the population is sufficient, but also that it is accessible, i.e. that each household either has the means to produce or buy its own food. So legislating for the right to food, I think, as we can see, is clearly a popular option amongst human rights organisations like the Scottish Human Rights Commission, Civic Scotland and the Scottish public. This petition gained 1,365 signatures, and also a number of respondents to the Good Food Nation consultation are also asking for a right of food to be included. On September the 13th, 2018, this Parliament also unanimously backed a Labour amendment calling for a Good Food Nation bill that has the right to food at its heart, and Scottish Labour has also called for a strategy to ensure that all policy areas concerning food are coherently managed in a way that enables people to access nourishing food. Now, I think the government's got a number of options on how they could implement a right to food. It could be part of the Good Food Nation bill. It could be a future implementation of human rights through framework legislation. It could be as part of a bill specifically on the right to food. And actually, I've also got a proposal for a private member's bill on the issue at the moment. I've been working on that. So I would respectfully ask the committee, if you're writing to the government to ask whether they've made any decision about what their preferred approach is, could you maybe ask that? And if not, when could we expect them to make a decision on that? Because I think that is going to have implications on how long the process of implementing any legislation would take. And I'll leave it at that, Convener. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sarah?
Thank you very much, Convener. I also very much welcome the petition, which highlights the need for legislation from the Scottish Food Coalition. I think their calls for a fairer, healthier, more sustainable food system in Scotland are relevant and they're timely. We need an explicit duty on our food system in Scotland to deal with our social and environmental challenges as well as our economic goals. And as a Co-op Party member, I want to strongly support their calls for food justice. There is clear support for legislation and it needs to be a right enshrined in law. In addition to this petition, there have been representation to the First Minister from 70 leading charities, academics, special interest groups and the UN Rapporteur for the Right to Food. So I think there's widespread support for action and it's a question of bringing it forward. As Elaine has said, there's a growing number of people and families reliant on food banks, and we've now got council setting up summer food schemes to enable that kids don't starve during the summer. Those are all great initiatives and there's lots of work by volunteers, but that's not the same as a proper right to food for everybody in Scotland. I just want to highlight the fact that there was research published by the University of Dundee this week which demonstrates that dealing with hunger would make an impact on the contribution to young people's learning and life chances and to the productivity of workers. So there are human rights here, but there are also wider benefits to society. So I very much want to welcome this petition. I hope it's taken forward by the Scottish Government. I'd be very keen to see committee members asking the Scottish Government to act on it, because once you've got the legislation, then we'd have action, then we'd have a strategy, then we'd see our planning system delivering more growing opportunities for people. We'd see this rolled out across the country, support for community gardens, support for allotments, and support for a policy on food and agriculture that would deliver these aims. And I think it's very timely, and I think this petition actually pulls together all the support there is out there, and I very much hope the committee will support taking this forward to the Scottish Government. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Are there any comments from the committee? Gail?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, first of all, it's an absolute disgrace that in this day and age we have to be looking at legislation so that people can have a right to food. But as both Elaine and Sarah have said, it is very tenuous with the Good Food Nation, the programme for government. I definitely think that we need to be following it up with the government to find out where exactly that fits in. If it does fit into the Good Food Nation bill, if it does sit with a member's bill, what exactly they are doing going forward. And yeah, I absolutely support the actions in this.
Right.
I think Sarah Boyer makes the point that, you know, basic good nutrition has such a roll-on effect on basic health, on ability in education, and not just in physical health but in mental health. It's such a huge impact, and I think the committee are aware it's the one thing that I talk about and bore you all to death about it. But thank you. I think that as the Good Food Nation bill has come back into the Parliament, I think that is a good opportunity to properly explore this. I note that Mike Ruskell asked whether or not that within the Good Food Nation bill the right to food would be forthcoming, and Joe Fitzpatrick had said there that they would look at how it would be done in practice, and I think that's the key element here. Is where what legislation would have to consider is what are the repercussions of non-compliance, and who would be responsible for ensuring that delivery. So I think on the basis the petition is completely right, you know, and I think nobody in their right mind would ever argue with what it's trying to do. But I think it's massively complicated, and if it's going to be enshrined in legislation, that legislation is going to have to be incredibly watertight to make this effective.
Okay. I mean, I suppose there's an issue, and I don't know if Elaine or Sarah have a comment on this, and I should declare an interest as a Labour and Cooperative MSP myself, and I'm very aware of the Food Justice Campaign and how it fits around a kind of a general issue around fairness and justice in society. But at what point is it about income? And, you know, if you simply say you have a right to food, it's not really about having a right to an income that allows you to feed your children in a nutritious way. Elaine?
Yeah, thanks, Convener. it would be my understanding it's enabling legislation. I mean, as I said, it's not about actually providing people directly with food. But if under that legislation you have things like statutory targets for reducing food insecurity, you may argue the case for a proper living wage and use that legislation to say if people had a proper living wage, then actually that would help with fulfilling our duties under our right to food legislation. So I'm not convinced it's very complicated. I think actually it's more enabling, and therefore it could be quite simple as part of a members' bill, although I would also like to see the government take it forward as part of the Good Food Nation bill. I think that makes sense if they were prepared to do that. So whilst it maybe sounds slightly complicated, I don't really personally think it has to be. If it's enabling, then it allows other things to happen. My sense is
the committee, and as Gail has said, the idea that in this day and age, in a country as prosperous as ours, people can't feed themselves is just a scandal. So what are the things that we can do to support that? And perhaps, I think as Elaine's described it then, has implications elsewhere. I think I'll take Sarah.
Just very much to directly answer that point, Convener. There was research published by the Co-op Party earlier this year which shows that at least 70,000 families are currently receiving support from Scottish local authorities through the Scottish Welfare Fund, at least in part due to a lack of food. So it's not that there's nothing happening, it's just we need a much more proactive approach, and if you have a rights-based at the heart of that, that then leads to other initiatives. I mean, as Rhoda says, we need a strategy that takes right across all the different policy areas. So it would be employment, it would be land, education, health. You need a joined up approach. But once you've got that right established, then that series of other legislative approaches can follow and government initiatives. And I think that picks up partly the point that Brian made, that the law is important, but there's a whole raft of other things then need to be looked at. But I think there's an urgency here, and that's why I think the petition is so important.
I think we're probably all violently agreeing here, which is, but some of the things that I've been working on and really, drive me along is this. Along with this idea, we have food poverty. We also have massive food wastage. And those two things just don't balance. There's some fantastic work going out there. There's a school in Cumnock who were throwing out 30% of their food. Now box that up into food portions, freeze it, and yesterday's boxes come back out and they're just left on the table and people lift them. So there's now no food wastage in there, and that's actually under the banner of environment. But there's a lot of moving. When I said this is complicated, that doesn't mean to say we shouldn't do it. But there's a lot of moving parts to this, and it's not just about one bill. I think it goes across a lot of portfolios here, and as a huge bit of work here that has to be done, I think.
Just briefly.
I think yes, I agree entirely with what Brian said, and indeed with both of our fellow MSPs here. I think one of the big issues I'd like to see, and it's coming in, is domestic science and home economics taught in schools. That is in the regulation for part of the curriculum, because I think people need to have more encouragement to do that, and that it comes back to food wastage, it comes back to nutritious food, growing your own, whatever it might be. And I agree entirely about community gardens and allotments, because in some cases there are some issues with councils where planning, people having difficulty getting access to allotments, and people are having difficulty even losing them because of other requirements that have been placed on it for building or development. So I think it goes across, but I'm certainly very supportive of it. and think it should be looked at.
Okay, thank you very much. As Brian says, we're violently agreeing with each other, which makes some of us feel a bit uncomfortable, but there you go. Can we write to the Scottish Government then, seeking its views in the action called for in the petition? And I think, yes, about the bill, but maybe about their broader strategy in relation to that. And obviously the campaigners will have the opportunity to respond to any submissions we receive ahead of our next consideration. And can I thank Sarah Boyack and Elaine Smith for their attendance. If we can now move on then to the next petition, which is petition 1734, Lower the Age of Hysterectomies by Megan Archibald, which calls on the Parliament to urge the Scottish Government urgently to review current NHS guidance surrounding the age and status at which women are considered for hysterectomies for chronic medical reasons. The petitioner states that women who are suffering with chronically painful periods are being denied a treatment option, a hysterectomy, which could relieve their pain until they are around 35 years old. In the petitioner's own case, that's 13 years away. The briefing prepared by Spice and the Clarks outlines the treatments available for primary and secondary dysmenorrhea. It also states there is no nationally prescribed age restriction for undergoing a hysterectomy, although clinicians would discuss the implications of the procedure for a woman of childbearing age. I wonder if members have any comments or suggestions for action. Right?
If it's not, probably not one you would have thought I would have got involved in here, but I actually saw this on the news, I'm pretty sure, fairly recently, where and it was a young woman describing her experiences, her horrendous experiences around, you know, the way the cycle was destroying her life, and that she wanted, she actually was almost begging the medical profession for to allow her to have this hysterectomy so she could actually live a normal life. So I think, you know, your gut, I can imagine a GP's gut reaction in a woman of that. I think she was only 21 or 22 years old, and I can imagine a GP suggesting that was too young, but there has to be some circumstances where other things are brought into consideration. So I would be inclined, I'd be quite interested to see what the Chief Medical Officer's thoughts were on this particular petition, because it seems to me, you know, that there is a need for this to be discussed.
Gail?
Yes, I agree. I mean, it's a very difficult situation, and absolute sympathy for sufferers, of course. I was quite interested to see that there was actually no prescribed age restriction. So obviously it's a case-by-case basis, and I just think that a woman knows her own body, and we definitely should be writing to the Chief Medical Officer to see what the guidance is. But yeah, I mean, a hugely difficult situation, but and a difficult decision as well.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose I'm quite interested in, and I don't think it's something we can ask government to comment on at this stage, but the extent to which there are serious attempts to address this problem, short of hysterectomy. And I know the petition makes the point about the impact of drugs, but you do wonder if it were, you know, if it was something that was a condition that was more known about, would more investment be made in addressing it? Because this does feel drastic, and a decision that feels right when you're 21 might not be the way you feel when you're 31, which I presume is why people are so risk averse. But I think if we agree to write to the Chief Medical Officer for Scotland, seeking their views, I think Gail's quite right. There seems to be a contradiction between saying you can't get a hysterectomy till you're 35, when in fact that's not what the guidance itself says. So we would be asking the Chief Medical Officer perhaps to comment on that, and what other work has been done around this whole area of a condition that would lead someone to want to make that decision when they're so young. Is that agreed?
I think exactly, and I agree with that entirely, Karina, but I also think maybe tease them out a bit about the research that's going on and what's actually happening, you know, and maybe be more specific in maybe a paragraph in that letter.
So if that's agreed, again, we're recognising just the dilemma in relation to this and want clarification around what actual best practice is, and we would want to thank the petitioner for bringing it to our attention, and again, she'll have the opportunity to comment on any responses that we receive before we consider it again. Yeah. If we can then move on to the next petition for consideration today, which is petition 1735, titled Include Pelvic Floor Education in the Baby Box Scheme by Elaine Miller. The petitioner is calling the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to include pelvic floor education in baby boxes to reduce stress and incontinence amongst new mothers and improve women's lifelong health and well-being. A briefing for this petition explains that while there is no information regarding pelvic floor exercises in the baby box, NHS Scotland's Guide to Pregnancy, Labour and Birth, Ready Steady Baby, which is distributed to all new mothers, has information on pelvic floor exercises and urinary incontinence. Neil Finlay MSP was unable to attend our meeting today, but has passed on the following comments in relation to the petition. I fully support this proposal, having worked for many years with women who have suffered a pelvic prolapse or incontinence after childbirth, and saw the disability and suffering caused by mesh implants that were supposed to repair this condition. It is essential that women are offered advice on restoring and maintaining good pelvic health. The baby box offers the opportunity to pass on advice and practical support about these issues to new mums. If this advice is followed, then it could prevent more women from having to experience surgery, continued pelvic problems, or having to live with incontinence. This is a common sense preventative proposal that I hope the committee will support. And I wonder if members have any comments or suggestions for action.
Yeah, I mean, I was completely supportive when I read the petition. I thought it was an excellent idea until I saw the answer from the Minister saying that the first midwife check-in, you know, you're provided with this information. So it's almost like a kind of flip scenario, because not everybody gets a baby box, but every new parent gets this guide. So I just wonder about the efficacy of putting it in a baby box if they're already getting it. But I do believe that we should write to the government, you know, as it's a new petition.
I agree with that. I wonder if somebody who's at the point where you've just had a baby and going rumbling through your baby box is what you're looking for as advice around pelvic floor exercises, when in fact, if it's at the early stages and through the process of the pregnancy, it's emphasised again and again through your antenatal classes and health visits and so on. But I don't think they necessarily are in contradiction with each other. You know, I think that I suppose it's a question of it wouldn't be one or the other, and I think the petitioner seems to be saying there's another area where there'd be an opportunity to highlight to mum that this is something that they could be doing. Yeah. Brian?
I think I agree with you. That's twice, Convener. I know. I'll get fired. I think that the opportunity here is, you know, given my daughter's a midwife, that they have that education throughout their pregnancy. And the fact is, at the end, when the baby arrives, there is some sort of literature there to back up all the learning that has been given throughout their pregnancy. I don't see it as particularly a hard practical issue to do. Why not? It would be the issue. It's not exactly going to be hugely expensive. It's not going to change the way in which these things are delivered. It's just another piece of information that's available. I think as often as you possibly can, we should be ensuring that that's there. So I don't see any problem with this. I think we should write to the Scottish Government to see whether this is something that has been considered. I know that Marie Todd, the Minister, has said that this happens anyway in other areas, but that doesn't mean to say that it shouldn't happen here as well.
I think we are agreeing to write to the Scottish Government asking its views on the action called. It may be, as Gail suggested, given that not everybody takes up the baby box, it's not going to be a universal issue. But I think we should also maybe be contacting the Royal College of Midwives and the Charter Society of Physiotherapy to the extent that they are confident that the messages around preventative action is getting through to women who are expecting babies. I think that's, you know, and is there enough time in the system to make sure that kind of those health messages are given out at a point where potential new mums are going to be receptive to them. Yeah. And I think it's right, these are not in contradiction with each other, but you wouldn't want the baby box message simply to be the substitute for the other things. And if there is clearly an issue around stress and incontinence, is there other things that could be getting done? And I think, you know, Neil Finlay's commitment round mesh is evident, and you can see that he's seeing the consequence of something that's been treated poorly. So anything that could prevent the need for that would obviously be really important. Yeah. Okay, in that case, as I said, we're agreeing to write to the Scottish Government and to the relevant bodies, and there will be an opportunity for the petitioner to respond to those submissions once they've been received. Can we now move on to the next petition, which is petition 1735 on vehicle collisions involving cats to be made a reportable offence, lodged by Mandy Hobbes on behalf of Cats Matter. The petition calls on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to introduce legislation to make the driver of a vehicle involved in an accident resulting in injury or death to a cat to stop and report the accident to the police. Current legislation requires the reporting of incidents which cause damage to a number of animals, including pigs, sheep and dogs. This requires the driver to stop and give their name and address, the name and address of the owner of the vehicle, and identification marks of the vehicle to any person with reasonable grounds to require this. If this is not done, then the driver must report the incident to the police within 24 hours. The legislation referred to, the Road Traffic Act 1988, is reserved with the exception of matters relating to the parking of vehicles on roads. And I wonder if members have any comments or suggestions for action. Gail?
Yeah, as the mother of 4 cats, I can completely understand where, you know, as petitioners coming from. I do believe that the reasoning behind the reporting of the animals that are on the list is because they're livestock or working animals, and therefore reporting them would it's almost like, you know, they would be losing money or whatever. I mean, absolutely. As I say, I have a lot of sympathy. I think that we should just write to. I think Police Scotland and SSPCA almost more so than the Scottish Government, but Scottish Government as well. But you know, I just think it's awful sad that we're talking about running over cats. But so yes, I would write to all 3 and just ask if we can have any bearing on changing the law, why the law is in place in the first place, and how enforceable it would actually be, because I think that's a difficulty as well, with cats being so small. And
I'd be interested to know. I mean, I think your point about working animals is kind of a throwback to another time. You know, if you're in rural or remote areas, yes, of course, then, you know, losing a sheep or a calf or a working dog would be quite significant. But I think we live in a different world now, and I think people see pet cats and pet dogs in the same place. And I know that, you know, I'm aware of folk close to myself who have very strong views on these things, that they feel that cats should be afforded the same respect almost as other domestic animals. And I think the point you make there is an important one. I think it would be useful to know, I suppose the question of Police Scotland is how enforceable it would be. The Scottish SPCA, I would also suggest writing to Cats Protection, because I know they do a lot of work, both in sort of even saving cats who have gone wild, and believe that they should be protected in law as well.
Can I just ask? I know that there's I believe that no, you have to compulsory microchip your dog, but you don't have to compulsory microchip your cat. And I wonder if that's something that we might have a look at as part of the questions as well, because obviously very difficult to identify a cat if it is hit by a car and it's not microchipped. So I think that would go hand in hand, and it is included here in the petition as well.
I think the campaign groups around that are very keen that cats get chipped
absolutely.
as well. I'll take David and then Brian.
Thank you, Convener. Is the Road Traffic Act 1988 not a reserved matter? So there's nothing the Scottish Government could really do about it. You'd have to actually, to be UK Government, you'd be writing to, wouldn't you?
Well, let's write to the Scottish Government and ask them. And even if it is that they make representations at a UK level, then it would be useful to know that. But it would also, presumably, there are not restrictions on Police Scotland in terms of legislation, because they would be acting under that legislation as well. Brian?
Yeah, having had that knock on the door to say run your cat over, somebody said, having that, and my daughter's had it as well. But you've also got cats are more likely to be to fall victim of road traffic acts, just given the nature of how we look after them and how they're allowed out. I think also that there's, to me, it's that I've also been, as my daughter as well, the cat disappeared. Likelihood is, you know, it's been run down, but that, you know, remembering it's a family pet and that not knowing as well. So that, I think the practicalities of it would be something that we'd have to look at. I think presumably that's why we would write to Police Scotland and RSPCA.
I think, Chair, I would say also the issue about companionship, and I'm dealing more with veterans and dogs and things like that. You know, cats can be very therapeutic to people, and that therefore would lessen the health bill and mental health, things like that. So I certainly think it's not a bad suggestion. It's just how it would be implemented.
Okay, in that case, we're agreeing to write to the Scottish Government and to explore the limit of their powers in relation to this, but also to Police Scotland, SPCA, Cats Protection, and if there are any other organisations that we think may have a view. And again, the petitioner will have the opportunity to respond to those submissions before our further consideration of this petition. And I'm going to suspend briefly. And then we can Okay. If we can call the meeting back to order. Our next new petition is Petition 1738, Student Teacher Bursaries for Full-Time Placement Students, lodged by David Malloy on behalf of Future Teachers of Scotland. The petition calls on the Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to provide bursaries to undergraduate teaching students undertaking full-time work placements. The petition highlights the workload of teaching students when on full-time placements and argues that financial aid would ease the financial burden on students who will struggle to find the time to additionally work part-time. The briefing prepared by Spice and the Clarks outlines time commitments for students on placement and academic study. It also details living cost support available for full-time graduate study at present. And I wonder if members have any comments or suggestions for action. Brian?
Well, I think in any which way which we can encourage or certainly take down barriers to entering into the teaching profession would be extraordinarily welcome. As we know, we're kind of very short of teachers at the moment. So I in first thought, I think that the petitioner has a very good point. In the back of my head, I'm thinking that. Am I right in saying that in England and Wales that happens? That there's a bursary system for people who have already got a degree in something else to then come back into teaching. There's a bursary system. Because one of my friends has just gone through that.
I think there are two separate things. There is the extent to which, if you're a student teacher, you are able, like other students, to have work to supplement your finances. But if you're working full time in teaching as on a student placement, you can't do that over a 4-year degree. There's a separate argument about where somebody has a degree and wants to become a teacher and as a 1-year qualification. Are people put off doing that because they can't afford to give up work in order to do it for a year? But I suppose the other comparison I noticed from the paperwork was that there is actually a bursary for nurses. And probably historically nurses would have been been on the ward longer than say the equivalent in teaching and so on. I'm not sure, but I wondered whether that difference is what's been highlighted here, and it's maybe something we could flag up to the Scottish Government. But I think the idea of creating incentive for people to be able to come into teaching is important, and whether the equivalence between doing a teaching degree and a degree that doesn't require placements, there isn't, in terms of financial pressures, there isn't an equivalency, and is this something that they've looked at?
Yeah, definitely right to Scottish Government. Yeah.
I certainly think this idea of removing barriers, I would like to, but is something we certainly should we should be looking at.
Sorry, I know there was an event last night talking about young people who are students who have no financial support from their families. I think it's called Standing Alone. How you could, without family support, do a university degree which involves very substantial placements, which precludes you from working part-time anywhere else. How you could do that? Does that mean there's a disadvantage on already disadvantaged people who are trying to get into teaching?
We not want to drag this whole thing. We're getting into that whole argument around bursary against student loan and that whole balance there, which is definitely something for the Education Committee. It's not for us, but I really do have a sympathy for this. My question was going to be: has the Education Committee looked at this? Is there anything we can pull out of that?
I'm no longer in the Education Committee, but when I sat on it, we did do a bit of work around understanding initial teacher education, the disincentives and barriers to people coming back into teaching, particularly folk who had already had a career who would like to go into teaching, and this barrier of actually having no income for a year was quite significant. But also this question of, if you're doing a degree that has placements, it's quite different from a degree that doesn't, because you'll not get the same opportunities. But I think there was a feeling then that we needed, and there is creative work being done around people maybe doing the diploma in education over a longer period, not having to do it in 1 year. So I think this would be another thing that we'd want them to look at. So I think we should write to the Scottish Government about this. And it may be that it's something we would want at some point to refer on to the Education Committee, but I think we want to look at it ourselves first. I would also suggest that we would write to the Scottish Council of Deans of Education, the NUS, but I also think the teaching unions might have a view in this because they may have a sense from their members to what extent this has created problems. Brian?
Doing this, can we look at whether or not that, because I'm pretty sure that south of the border that they are actually have a different set of rules and regulations in terms of that 1 year teacher education, and has that had an impact on teacher numbers? I would be interested to hear on that.
Of course, there was a distinction because in England you could teach without a teaching qualification, and the whole thing, I'm sure I'm age now, but non-certificated teaching was ruled out in Scotland a long time ago, so there is a difference there, but that would be something to be worth looking at. But I think we're recognising, not just for the individuals that are highlighted by the petitioner, about the challenges that people face if they're, have a lot of responsibility in placements and trying to manage their finances in comparisons with other professions like nursing, but specifically on whether this is actually a barrier to us being able to recruit more teachers. I think that would be worth exploring that. And when we have responses, again, the petitioner will be able to respond to those submissions before we consider them further. Okay, if we can then move on to our next petition, which is petition 1739, Improve Access to Weight Loss Surgery by Tom Aldridge, calls on the Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to amend its criteria for the qualification of bariatric surgery, also known as weight loss surgery, in line with National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, NICE guidance. The briefing prepared by Spice and Clarks outlines the NICE guidance, the guidance for Scotland and treatment pathways prior to bariatric surgery. Since lodging the petition, Mr Aldridge has contacted Clarks to say that he's been advised by NHS officials that the policy which the petition is seeking to change has been amended. He has, however, been unable to see an updated copy of the guidance for confirmation of this change. And I wonder if members have any comment or suggestions for action. Well, Gail?
I think we absolutely need to see the policy change before we can decide whether or not it's adequate for, and the petitioner needs to see it as well to see if it's adequate for his needs.
Okay.
Has been changed.
Okay. Brian?
I'm going to make myself unpopular here. More unpopular. My concern is around the way in which there are those for which bariatric surgery is an essential procedure, given the conditions they have. But I also think that there is a huge rise in the instances of bariatric surgery, and my concern is around those who it's not essential and haven't actually had the offer of other treatments prior to this, and it becomes almost a fallback. I'll be okay because I can get this particular procedure. So, and the other thing I'd want clarification on, as well as it says here that the surgery is only available in Scotland for people who have type 2 diabetes. I don't think that's right. I'm not convinced that's right. So I would like to check that as well. But bariatric surgery is a serious surgery, and I think and absolutely there are those who must have the procedure because it's essential for the conditions they have. I think the way in which we view that is starting to change, and that concerns me quite a lot. So I would be interested, as Gail also says, to understand what changes have been made to the legislation by the Scottish Government.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, just for the official record, the petitioner does say, to be clear, the pathway should be for patients who have exhausted all other pathways. So he has made that clear in his petition.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we would want to see this as the first point, but whether people are unnecessarily being excluded, I think that is something that the petitioner would wish to highlight. And I think the fact that it looks as if there's been a change in the guidance, it would be important in order for us to be able to pursue the petition to actually understand what the situation is. So I think we're agreeing to write the Scottish Government seeking its views on the actions called for the petition and clarification on what the actual guidance is before we take any further action on the petition. Is that agreed?
Yeah, agreed.
Okay, and again with thanks to the petitioner, and he will be able to respond to any submissions that are provided. If we can then move on to the next petition, which is petition 1740 on improving the handling of complaints about public services, lodged by Rachel Lowther on behalf of Accountability Scotland. The petition calls on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to improve complaints handling in the following ways: to allow the Scottish Public Service Ombudsman to take complaints in any format, to require bodies under SPSO jurisdiction and the SPSO to permit complainants to audio record meetings and phone calls and use this as evidence in any subsequent complaint. Legislation currently limits the SPSO as to what format individuals can submit complaints. This is done predominantly in writing, and a complainer is required to demonstrate exceptional circumstances in order to submit a complaint or evidence in a format other than in writing. Our paper for this petition states that the SPSO has said it would like to see legislative changes in this area so that submissions can be made in various formats without the need to demonstrate exceptional circumstances. The committee may also wish to note that we've received written submissions from the Chairperson and Secretary of Accountability Scotland, who are both supportive of the action called for in the petition. Members may also wish to note that while our papers state that the petition did not collect any signatures or comments, this is because the petitioner elected not to collect signatures and comments, and I wonder if members have any comments or suggestions for action. Gail?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite straightforward, to be honest. The legislation to me seems to be a little bit out of date given the digital age that we live in now. I think to be open and accountable, they really should be looking at a legislative change. And to see in our papers it said that there has been discussions with the Scottish Government and they have been positive. I think we need an update on what those discussions have been, what the outcomes are, if there are any outcomes. If they're not, when can we expect them? And to also write to the Ombudsman itself and to Accountability Scotland just to seek their views as well. But I see it as being quite straightforward, to be honest.
I suppose the balance is to make sure that the complaint is a serious one, so it has been provided in a way in which people who are making the complaint regard it as a serious complaint. But I think I would agree very much with Gail that technology has moved on from the days when you would be asking for something in written form, and maybe even just on that basis the legislation needs to be addressed. But I think Gail has probably comprehensively outlined the action that we would want to take, unless anybody wants to add anything. No, in that case we are writing to the Scottish Government seeking its views, and to Scottish Public Services Ombudsman and Accountability Scotland seeking their views on the action called for in the petition. And again, the petitioner will have an opportunity to respond to those submissions ahead of further consideration by the committee, and want to thank the petitioner for submitting the petition. If we can now move on to the next petition for consideration, which is petition 1741 on human rights, citizenship and legal protection for people with lifelong learning disabilities, lodged by Keith Lynch on behalf of People First Scotland. The petition calls on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to introduce a new law addressing the needs and rights of people with lifelong learning disabilities in Scotland. In 2017, NHS Health Scotland published its People with Learning Disabilities in Scotland Health Needs Assessment Report, which aims to provide policymakers, service planners, service commissioners and funders and practitioners with a broad overview of the evidence of the health needs of adults with learning disabilities. The Scottish Government's Learning Disability Strategy, Keys to Life, was launched in 2013 and was refreshed in March 2019 with an implementation framework and priorities 2019-2021. There is currently an ongoing independent review of learning disability and autism in the Mental Health Act 2003. Part of the review's remit is to look at whether the law needs to change for people with learning disabilities and or autistic people with regards to the Mental Health Act's abilities to support people's human rights. Recent reporting from the review has concluded that, quote, autistic people and people with learning disability are not well served overall by the Mental Health Care and Treatment Scotland Act 2003. The review's final report and recommendations will be submitted to the Scottish Government Minister for Mental Health in December 2019. And I wonder if members have any comments or suggestions for action. Brian?
I find that this particular petition I'm really interested in, because I happen to work with a young lad in Trackfield who has lifelong learning disabilities and has gone through this process of coming out of he was in care was advised to adoption, and now he's got to a level where he has now left home and in his own place. And this idea around managing of the finances, even though he asked that his adoptive parents look after his finances, the system kind of railed against that. You know, so I would like to. I'm very interested in this petition. I would like to see it. Some information brought in around the key stakeholders for this, around Scottish Learning Disability Observatory, Commission for Learning Disability, Annual Mental Welfare Law Society. I think the Human Rights Commission has a place to play in here as well. I think that over and above, you know, obviously the normal right to the Scottish Government to see what their thoughts on this are, because I think there is holes in legislation here that need to be filled in. I know there's a lot of work being done on this area, and the system is starting to improve, but my feeling and my sense from the adoptive parents and from the people that I'm working with is that there is still some more work to be done.
Can I? Yes, Karina. I actually understand where the petition is coming from. One of the things we talk, obviously through life, it's important that we respect the further education and higher education, because there is certainly a shortfall there. I know of, because my own son is dyslexic, and we've managed to sort things out, and the college has been fantastic. But there's something I'd like to cover actually in education there, because that's not happening. It stops. It wouldn't stop, but it's delivered a different way, and it's not as successful as it is in primary, secondary education.
I think there's an issue around, we have made huge progress in my lifetime, taking people out of long stay hospitals, understand people can achieve their potential, they can work and can learn and all the rest of it, you know, with a learning disability as with other people. But it's whether the legislation has a person with a learning disability at the centre. So is there legislation that specifically understands the connection around mental health or education, right to education, right to employment and so on, and particularly exercised by the transition stage from secondary school into adult life. I think there is an issue there that maybe this is trying to look at as well. I think it's to ensure the progress that has been made in understanding that, you know, that the capacity for people with learning disabilities to achieve all sorts of amazing things needs to be matched by systems that support them. And I think the suggestions that have been made about writing to the Scottish Government and to the key stakeholders, I think we're all agreed that that should be done. And the question is, should there be a bit of legislation that outlines the rights of people with learning disabilities, or how do we make sure that their needs are mainstreamed into other legislation? It would be useful to have a view on that, if that's agreed.
Can I add one other organisation convener to this, is the SQA, and I come back to my point. Because one of the things I've been campaigning for recently is to do with the acceptability of having some exams taken orally. And that hasn't fallen on stony ground. That's been, and including the current Deputy First Minister I spoke to about it, and now his capacity as education, and also met with the Chief Executive of SQA about it. And it goes further than that, because actually it has to be related to the institutes who set the parameters for shall we say, chartered accountants or engineers or apprenticeships or what have you. So it's quite a big area, but I would ask that we write also the SQA and get their views, because there's a new CEO there who I haven't met, but I'm sure hopefully would have the same views as the previous one.
If that's agreed, then I think there's a substantial bit of work to be done there, and understanding the extent to which the system does meet the needs of people with learning disabilities right throughout their lives. And we, again, would want to thank the petitioner, and they'll have an opportunity to respond to the submissions ahead of any further consideration. If we can then move on to our next petition, which is petition 1742 on amending antisocial behaviour legislation to tackle neighbouring household odours, lodged by Michael W. Pringle. The petition calls on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to create a new antisocial behaviour order designed to tackle situations where a neighbour reputedly refuses to deal with odours or pollution leaking into neighbouring properties, Our paper for this petition details a number of ways that councils can deal with antisocial behaviour, including using mediation, agreeing an acceptable behaviour contract, referring the matter to the police and obtaining an ASBO. The paper also makes clear that an ASBO is a civil court order, but that breaching this is a criminal offence. Under current legislation, local authorities have a duty to inspect their areas to detect whether a nuisance exists or is likely to occur or recur. An authority must also take steps as are reasonably practicable to investigate any complaint of statutory nuisance from a person living in its area. Evaluating the existence of a statutory nuisance is a matter for a local authority. And I wonder if members have comments or suggestions for action. Gail?
Yes, I found this one particularly difficult because it seems to have arisen from a planning issue, from an adaptation that was made to a neighbouring property and therefore resulted in various odours, mostly cooking odours, permeating the petitioner's house, and it's been going on for a long time, and I do have absolute sympathy. I think we do need to find out how instances like this can be dealt with. I understand that the relationship with the neighbour has broken down irreparably, which is also disappointing. But I'm not sure if it's antisocial. I don't know if it fits into that box. I just wonder if there's maybe some sort of local planning issue that stopped this or prevents the neighbour being compelled into making adaptations that would stop this happening. So I think that we need to get clearer guidance on where this particular case would fall.
I mean, it's also not the place of the committee to deal with an individual complaint and concern. It's what are the kind of policy conclusions that come from it, and you're quite right to say that there are issues around is it planning or whatever it is. I think there are two questions for me, having looked at what we're reporting in legislation. Does the legislation ever recognise that odour or smell can be antisocial? You know, if you leave rotting stuff out in your garden and it creates, you know, not as a health issue, but maybe creates rotten smells, it would seem the legislation doesn't deal with that in a way that it does with noise, and maybe it just simply had not been considered at the time the legislation went through. So I think that would be the first question. Is there a view in government that they would at least look to review this? But secondly, there's an issue about enforcement. Because although there's a lot of responsibilities in local authorities around antisocial behaviour, the question for me is, do they have the capacity actually to enforce that, given the amount of pressure it's on local resources? And I wonder whether some of that has fallen away, so that even if somebody doesn't follow planning, who is enforcing it? Who's going to go and do that job of ensuring the obligations are pursued? And if we do agree that odour and smell caused by coming from somebody else's property is an issue at local authority level, do they think they've got the capacity to deal with it? Brian?
I agree with that. I think that I'd be interested to see whether, I'd be surprised if current legislation doesn't actually cover this. But I think it's, does it not?
Well, I suppose they can. From what I've read from the Spice report, they do identify noise, but they don't identify odour. But it may be the odour coming from fly tipping and all the other things that are identified. But I guess it would be a question of asking the Scottish Government, do they really think the legislation needs to be changed?
Authority, but I mean, where does SEPA sit within this? For example, is there other legislation, environmental legislation that covers this as well? I would be surprised if this isn't covered in some way or other. But it comes down to an enforceability, an ability to enforce.
Does it fall within environmental health? And it would look, even if it does fall within environmental health, I mean, not to deal with the individual issue, but the question is, in circumstances, could environmental health deal with it?
Well, that's what I'm saying. We're looking at a specific legislation here. I'm not convinced it doesn't sit within a wider legislation here, and I would like to at least explore that first and foremost.
Okay, and Morris?
I would agree certainly with what Brian's saying, because the SEPA item certainly comes to mind straight away to talk about it, because that if it's transgressing through a property, either through the air or through whatever medium it is, I think it's still responsibility for them. The other thing is about enforcement officers. There is a general shortage of enforcement officers in Scotland and local authorities. It's down, funding and things like that. And I know you've got in our Garnbutte, and I quote that, there's about 2 of them, and it's very difficult to cover it. So legislation is difficult to enforce. So that's the thing we need to highlight.
Okay. Any other comments? I think we're agreeing there's an issue here. Where does it lie? The responsibility lie? It may be that it's not antisocial behaviour, but it is something that still has to be addressed. And in what way could it be addressed? I think we're agreeing to write the Scottish Government and COSLA seeking their views on the action called for it in the petition. Are they confident that this would be covered in the normal run of things? I'm not. Well, I suppose we could clarify the role of SEPA in this. But I don't think SEPA deals with individual households. I mean, some of this is about, for example, odour, if I remember correctly, is for business premises, but it doesn't cover domestic premises, so that would be something we could look at. But I think we recognise there may be an issue here if something is falling between areas of responsibility. So we want to raise these with the Scottish Government, and the petitioner will have the opportunity to respond to the submissions at a later date. So I thank the petitioner for lodging that petition. And if we could then move on to, I think, our final petition for the day. Our final petition for consideration today is petition 1749 on the financial viability of listed buildings, lodged by Ronald Morrison. The petition calls on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to ensure that financial viability studies are conducted on listed buildings requiring restoration and/or maintenance. Responsibility of ownership is established for this work, and financial assistance is provided where listed buildings are at risk of falling into disrepair. Our paper for this petition makes clear that responsibility for the repair and maintenance of a listed building lies solely with its owner. Historic Environment Scotland, however, operates a historic environment repair grant scheme that can support the cost of conservation standard repair projects for listed buildings that meet certain eligibility criteria. The Planning 1997 Act provides planning authorities with powers to issue urgent works repairs notices to owners of listed buildings. In addition, the Building Scotland Act 2003 grants local authorities powers to deal with dangerous and defective buildings, either themselves or through the issue of notices requiring works to be undertaken by the owners of the building. Our paper also highlights that local authorities can have problems in establishing who ultimately owns a building or in recovering costs incurred in exercising its statutory repair functions from a property owner based overseas. Concerns about not recovering costs can act as a disincentive to local authorities using all available statutory powers. I wonder if members have any comments or suggestions for action. Brian?
Quite pertinent for my area, given that this specifically would affect the Air Station Hotel, which is owned by somebody in Malaysia and is currently costing the public purse something in the region of £5,000 a day to keep it standing until they work out what to do with it. So I think this petition specifically interests me around the legislation and ability, because it is registered as a listed building, and the actual powers that the local authority have at the moment to do something about it, given that the owners over the last 10 years have allowed it to fall into serious disrepair, and the impact that then has. The air station's been closed before because of this particular hotel, and as I said, the local authority have had to take action in putting scaffolding up that's rented at £5,000 a day while they find out what to do with it. So definitely think we should be writing to the Scottish Government around the action that's called for in the petition. But you've got a whole load of others, Historic Environment Scotland obviously, but I think the Royal Town Planning Institute and Build Environment Forum would be really interesting to see what they have to say and what the petition's asked for.
I suppose the dilemma is where the responsibility lies and what incentive is there on an owner to maintain or repair a property if the public purse is going to pick it up at a later stage.
But if you're sitting in this particular instance, there's a danger to public there's a danger to the connectivity of the whole of the west of Scotland, or the southwest of Scotland. It's not just about, you know, it's not my responsibility. They did buy that property with specifically with the intention of redeveloping it, but have just left it, and it's got to a point where, you know, it's a danger to the public.
So I think we're agreeing there's an issue here. We're not quite sure what the solution would be in terms of the public purse taking on responsibility, enforcing obligations on owners, and not losing important properties because the owner is indifferent, I guess. I think that's the challenge. So I think, as Brian has suggested, we're going to write to Scottish Government and to key stakeholders, and once we, and they will, you know, in considering the petition, I think will reflect these concerns as well.
COSLA as well, because we need to get the 32 local authorities' views, because I know from experience we've had issues in my area on that listed buildings, and particularly the west of Scotland, because we've got quite a lot of sandstone building we should have granite rather than sandstone, and therefore we're going to face more of this issue as we go forward in the wet climate.
We're also agreeing to write to COSLA at this stage, and obviously again to thank the petitioner, and once the submissions have been provided, there'll be a further opportunity to respond ahead of our consideration of the petition in the future. So with that, can I recognise we've done a substantial amount of work to date. We're grateful for all the new petitions, and they'll provide us with plenty of challenges for the future. And with that, can I thank you for your attendance and close the meeting?
Thank you.